Yes, guys, how you doing? Welcome back to the channel. I hope you're all happy and healthy, doing the things that you love, or those you love to do them with. Please smash the like button, smash the granny out of it if you enjoy this content. Hit the subscribe if you haven't already. Hit the notification bell and drop a comment. Let me know your thoughts on today's topic. And it's a really interesting update where we have to kind of work and weave our way through the corridors of curiosity and around what this might mean for various different topics regarding to FFP, PSR, ownership, and the tangled web of overlaps between third parties that have stakes in multiple clubs. This particular story is directly involving, in the most part, West Ham United, although there's overlaps into Aston Villa when it comes to women's team sales stakes and the actual overall sale of West Ham United that is quite it's quite multifaceted and it's quite a lot. As I've sort of peeled the onion layer back on this and figured out who owns what, where's the interest coming from, who knows who, and what does this possibly mean for future PSR and FFP connotations, then you're going to have to bear with me if this one's a little bit confusing. It's not directly relating to Tottenham Hotspur. This is why you might be seeing this on the Spurs Talk Show and or just Sean Butler TV. On Sean Butler TV, we do just talk about football finance and ownership alongside other topics of interest, but not just Tottenham Hotspur. On the Spurs Talk Show, obviously, we talk mainly about Tottenham. And so it's not directly relating to Tottenham, but of course, indirectly, anything that happens in the Premier League can have byproduct benefits or negatives, depending on how you perceive them. Let's start with the story, right? So I'm going to bring this story up here from Football Insider, which is kind of summarizing a lot of what else has been said over the last few days. So Stefan Borson has dropped the £250 million takeover claim. West Ham could be set for an ownership shakeup following their miserable season at London Stadium. West Ham insider ex-WHU employee or WHU employee reported on the 9th of May via, this is a hard tongue twister, that one, via the West Ham way, a wealthy American is preparing to make an offer for the Gold family stake in the club. Now, Vanessa Gold, right, who inherited her father, David Gold's 21.1 stake following his passing in 2023, previously announced her intention to sell the shares. Now, I believe that they have been caught up in probate for the last few years since her father and her sister's passing, a tragic scenario. But now they've come out of probate, that stake is open to being sold. So 25% stake. Stefan Borson is saying that West Ham's valuation could have increased after the Chelsea owners have agreed a £20 million deal for an 8% stake in their women's team. So Chelsea owners had nothing to do. It's not the West Ham's women's team. They've basically agreed a 20% deal for an 8% stake in their own women's team, which essentially values their football club at, I think it's £245 million. Now, Chelsea women's team has a lot more revenue than any other women's team, I think, other than maybe Arsenal, because of the size of the stadium and how often it's filled up at the Emirates for women's football. But in terms of success, Chelsea women's team, I think, have won the last 6 WPL Premier Leagues. Now, let's carry on with the story for a second. Alongside Gold's 25.1%, David Sullivan currently holds nearly 40% share in the club, while Daniel Kretinsky's share is worth 27%, and Albert Tripp Smith retains an 8% shareholding at the London Stadium. Now, for what it's worth, Kretinsky also owns the LA Dodgers, and I think has a large stake in the LA Galaxy, and also owns, wait for it, 12.7% in Blueco, who, of course, is the vehicle that Todd Klein owns or is heavily invested in, that is the largest slice of Chelsea's owner, and of whom Chelsea sold their own women's team to for whatever it was, 200 million or something last year in order to circumvent FFP and PSR rules. Now, as the story continues here, Everton chief Keith Winers, or former Everton chief Keith Winers, told Football Insider that Bobby Kotick could be behind the latest West Ham takeover bid. But other stories are suggesting that's not the case, and that it's actually a guy called Mark Walter of Guggenheim Partners, who have about £260 billion of assets under management, and they own, wait for it, 13% of Chelsea. So Albert Tripp Smith already owns 8% of West Ham, He's looking to buy Vanessa Gold's 25% stake, and then also wants to buy the 25% circa 25%, whatever it is, 26% stake of West Ham that Kretinsky owns, that would essentially leave him with about 60% of the club. That would then obviously make him the number one shareholder and be able to outweigh any potential like some sort of courtroom battles, if you like, that would happen with the other main shareholder, which of course is David Sullivan. Now, it remains to be seen whether or not Sullivan has any ability and any funds to be able to buy up the shares that are on offer from Vanessa Gold or from Kretinsky. That doesn't look to be the case. West Ham fans often criticizing their owners for not having the ambition or maybe just not having the liquid cash to be able to do what other teams are doing. But for sure, Kretinsky certainly does. Through his ownership, he's worth about £14 billion, but he wants out. He's happy to double his money. According to this story, he's happy to double his money. I think he paid £150 million, something like that, for the club. Let's carry on with this story, though, just so I'm not missing anything out. A 25% stake could be worth a fair bit, especially if their women's team is now worth 20 times their revenue. So that 20 times their revenue, we're talking about West Ham's women's team now, is based on the fact that that Chelsea's recent sale to themselves and via the Blueco purchase and their recent 8% selling of that club for £20 million is 20 times their revenue. They won't have big revenue, but if an American investor believes that the women's team and the women's team proposition has real value on its own, then all of a sudden, all the major clubs have got a major additional asset that sort of came from nowhere in value terms and is now worth maybe £100 million on its own. So potentially there's a little added extra. But generally, West Ham are a club with a 60,000 average attendance, which is notable. There may well be a feeling in the investment community, particularly from the US, that relegation is now extremely unlikely for some of these clubs. We are likely to have a situation this season where 3 teams have got around 40 points that have stayed up. Those 3 teams are Tottenham, United and West Ham. It may be that the perception going forward is that actually, if you are a side of big enough scale, then you are more or less guaranteed Premier League survival. That seems to be the tale of the tape recently with regards 3 teams coming up, 3 teams going back down. It will probably in all likely happen next season as well. So there's definitely some merit to this argument. And as a valuation metric, if you don't have to worry about the significant financial losses of relegation, or at least you don't have to worry about it as much as you maybe have done in the past, then obviously valuations go up because cash flow is guaranteed, and cash flow, the cash cow that is the Premier League merit points, certainly, and obviously the TV media broadcast money is certainly part of that pie. If that becomes the case and relegation is less of a risk, then valuation should go up. I just said this. The top and bottom is, I think that 25% of West Ham could be worth 250 million, yada, 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 right? So that's fine. Now, I'm going to pivot to the rest of this story over here for a second, if I show you this story, because we were talking about Todd Boehly, right, who's actually being linked with a West Ham takeover before eventually leading the purchase of Chelsea. The jury remains out on the Blueco ownership of West Ham London rivals Chelsea, with supporters venting against the board during protests. As I say, there's a lack of ambition, and we're talking about majority owner David Sullivan. As the story goes on, the Blues could be set to lose a key stakeholder amid a stunning new £260 million twist involving a US-backed bid for a West Ham takeover. So here's the story, right? So Vanessa Gold, or David Gold's company, and Summers, is forcing them to sell because of mounting debts, 25% stake, yada, yada, yada. But Albert Tripp Smith has been revealed as the guy who wants to buy West Ham, who already has the 8% stake. So he wants to get to 60%. Now, he's already the co-founder of GSO Capital Partners, which is the credit investment platform of the Blackstone Group. Now, if you're a Tottenham fan or a Crystal Palace fan, but especially if you watch this channel, you will know that David Blitzer, who is the chief of the Blackstone Group, is a part owner of Crystal Palace. Blackstone Group being the second biggest private equity firm, with something insane like 2 trillion, I think it is, of assets under management, an insane amount of money. Anyway, the American investment, I think the only hedge fund that has higher assets under management is BlackRock Capital, but Blackstone Group is number 2. Smith has serious money himself, but it is the money or the people he associates with that will be ploughing money into the Hammers should he get his way. One of whom is Chelsea part owner Mark Walter. Guggenheim Partners CEO Mark Walter co-owns Chelsea in another US consortium, and it is claimed he personally owns just under 13% of the Stamford Bridge outfit, with Boehly, who is a former president of Guggenheim Partners. You see what's going on here, people? Chelsea Blackstone Group, Blueco, West Ham United. It's a little bit of back scratching, and we've seen a lot of back scratching going on around the Premier League with other relationships. Chelsea and Newcastle, Chelsea's other major investor, Clearlake Capital. Also, by proxy of that, they have invested in Clearlake Capital, who happen to be, wait for it, the PIF fund, who of course are the main owners of Newcastle United. On this channel and on Spurs Talk Show, and on Sean Butler TV, which is the one you're watching on, I've uploaded videos for myself with Johnny last year, I think it was, talking about potential loopholes for the FFP and the PSR rules that may yet be exploited. And within 48 hours, 2 of those 11 rules that we came up with were exploited based on the relationships that exist between Saudi, between Newcastle, Chelsea, Aston Villa, Everton. I think we're involved in that one as well. This story is going somewhere, guys. I'm going to finish it off right now because you might not be interested just in West Ham, but this does affect everybody in an interesting way, and I'll show you how in just a second. Guggenheim Partners, he owns 13%, is a global investment firm said to have £260 billion in assets, right? A lot of money. Now, top level West Ham insider Sean Whetstone has revealed that Trip Smith is planning a coup which will take over the 60% share and outvote remaining shareholder Chiefly Sullivan. Whetstone says Krasinski, who also owns his boyhood club, Sparta Prague, could be probably persuaded to sell if someone doubles the 168 million, there you go, I said 170 million he invested in 2021. Now, Krasinski also owns, as I said, 20% in the National Basketball Association's LA Lakers and 12.7% of Blueco. Right? So, here's the problem, or here's the situation. FFP and PSR is already on a knife edge. We've seen what happened in November and December when Manchester City basically took the Premier League to court. Leicester City took the Premier League to court for other reasons and won, used the appeal court against them and got away with it because of the rules weren't clear around the Championship. How much of the sort of the debts and the losses and the amounts they could spend were unaccounted for in the Championship books when they were in the Championship. Manchester City took them to the court and essentially of appeal, and certainly won when it came to third-party transactions with regards how is it okay for owners to be able to do debt-free financing when we're not allowed to be able, or relatively low interest financing when we can't do essentially third-party transactions at whatever price we want to. That's sort of undemocratic, and it's also kind of blindly in the face of competition law, and they won. So all of those changes towards PSR and FFP that were going to happen were put on ice because there was a lot of kind of murky waters and opaque outcomes that we didn't really know what was intended. And so all of the rules that were going to reflect the current UEFA rules around 70% wage to turnover ratios and squad cost ratios, yada, 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 that was already in place for the UEFA competitions were going to be implemented, I think, at an 85% threshold in the Premier League. All of that is on hold, and we're currently sticking to the built rules around £105 million net losses over 3 years. As a consequence of that, no teams were in breach of FFP and PSR last year. Now, how I'm tying these things together is, of course, you have the women's team story with West Ham and how that's going to inflate valuations. You've also got Aston Villa that are now looking to sell a stake or their entire women's team, maybe to themselves, to their owners, doing something like what Todd Boehly did with Blueco, as they have to get around their own FFP and PSR issues, as they will now be participating in Europe again next season and have to get that squad cost ratio down to 70%. So they're either going to have to sell some of their assets, and the story is, of course, as we've spoken about before, Emi Martinez and the guy who's Bailey is going to be probably sold at inflated market fees to their friends in Saudi Arabia again. I mean, there's also rumors today that Manchester United might be looking at Martinez as well. But either way, you can see what's happening here. It's a tale of the tape. Same thing happened with John Duran last year as well. Massively overinflated fees. So the kind of rules don't really hold up to water when you have relationships that can scratch each other's backs. And when you see now that West Ham United might be getting into bed in a more serious way with an owner that will have a 60% stake in Trip Smith, not just a 27% stake, where the ability to work together with other owners of other clubs is a little bit more palpable and a little bit more clear, then what you might have is yet more dissidents that can join the current group of teams that vote against PSR and FFP rule changes. Now, the rules around how many teams in the Premier League that need to vote in favour of an amendment for it to pass is 2/3 of the participants or 14 teams. So if 6 teams is the maximum amount of teams that can be dissidents, that can deny or reject any favorable movements towards any changes. And if that happens, if a seventh team rejects it, then nothing will change. And we've seen in the last incarnation of these suggested rule changes that there were 4 teams that voted against, that were Aston Villa, Manchester City, Newcastle, and Nottingham Forest. And the 5th team was Chelsea, that abstained from the vote. And an abstention is essentially the same thing as a rejection, because you have to have approvals. And so 5 teams voted against. Now, what you might see happening here, guys, is a world where West Ham can join that group. If they are suddenly being parked into the category of being able to scratch each other's backs, as we have seen in a never-ending amount of examples over the last 2 or 3 years, between certain clubs helping each other out, getting each other out of binds to get themselves the right side of PSR and FFP, then you might see that those things also manifest in new ways, where essentially rules do not now have enough votes to move. So if West Ham was to join that kind of cartel or cabal or whatever you want to call it, a dissident group of people that don't want to move in that direction, then that it's going to be problematic. All you need is one more team to abstain or to move in the other direction, and essentially then nothing will ever change. The loopholes will never close, and the teams with the owners that have the most ambition and the biggest and deepest pockets, who want to be able to spend their money and continue to move the needle and move things around and be able to rob Peter to pay Paul, sell your left arm to your right arm and loan it back, all of the things that we have seen being utilized in a number of different ways over the last couple of years, that will continue to happen, and it will continue to be a race to the bottom. To me, it's quite scary. All of these things, of course, are hypotheticals. We're not sure exactly what's going to happen with regards the West Ham story, but for sure, you can expect to see teams that have investors that are used to spending and have assets under management and risk profiles and the experience of dealing in significant amounts of money, that pushing numbers and clever accounting is going to be an ever-present part of the narrative. Now, you might think, well, why would West Ham join the teams at the top? Because FFP and PSR is sort of born out of an idea to stop the teams at the top from being able to just spend more and break competition. It's actually not the case, right? FFP and PSR essentially was born to try to prevent ownership from, well, it's been the rules, or sorry, the kind of nomenclature and the directives of it have changed from being competitive level playing field to essentially bringing back the idea that the deepest pockets can't win, although it hasn't obviously worked. But you have to go back to 2013 when FFP financial fair play was first introduced. There were 6 teams that initially voted against it. So all it needed was one more, and the entire FFP would have been blown out of the water at its first incarnation. This was in 2013. Listen to the names of the teams that voted against it back then: Fulham, West Brom, Manchester City, Aston Villa, Swansea, and Southampton. Now, if you think back to Manchester City in 2013, were not Manchester City of today. Aston Villa were not the Aston Villa of today. In fact, they got relegated a couple of years after that. So the idea of FFP is not just about trying to curtail the teams at the top from having these runaway methods to being able to do things that other teams can't compete. In its first initial incarnation, most of the teams that voted against them were actually relegation threats, teams that were struggling to stay up and were worried about the idea of FFP and PSR coming in, or FFP at the time, there was no PSR, but FFP at the time coming in to stop them being able to spend money to give them a chance of staying up. And so it's not so much about this notion of keeping the top, drawing the top back in. There's also the threat of keeping the bottom out, making sure that no one can get in and get out of that elite group at the top. And the people at the bottom of the Premier League at the time, the teams that were coming up and going down, were very worried about this notion of what financial fair play really meant to them, which is an inability to break into the teams that compete. Really what it comes down to is, do you have owners with deep pockets and ambition to be able to spend money that is or isn't theirs, to be able to get themselves into the realms of competitive outcomes and hopefully success on the pitch for the fans, but really for them, it's about being able to get returns on investment. Remember, in a previous video we spoke all about this research report that came out regarding American investment into the Premier League, and before they get an entry, they're looking for an exit. The first question that they always ask these consultants that are there to advise and strategize on buying sports clubs is, what's my exit? And that to me is a concern, especially when you now see things like I said at the start of this conversation, that the women's team valuations are 20 times what their revenue is, something that is just not really feasible in any other typically sports related industry unless they are nascent and fledgling, which of course the women's team is. And on top of that, if you now know that relegation is essentially an unlikely scenario, then your revenues are pretty much guaranteed, especially in a world where the Premier League the Premier League TV broadcasting rights that will be essentially renegotiated in 3 years' time will in all likely have its final incarnation as a Sky Sports broadcaster version and will suddenly move towards a wholly controlled Premier League Netflix for sports. So the revenues will continue to go up. The risk of dropping revenues is essentially vanishing, and the avenues in which you can find multipliers to be able to either push money around on a piece of paper are continuing to be found and exploited by teams with owners that want to do it. And unfortunately, if you're an owner of a football, if you're a fan of a football club whose owner isn't engaged in those sorts of activities, isn't part of a multi-club ownership model, isn't owned by sorts of hedge funds or nation states that have a lot of experience working in numbers that have several more zeros than your average business, then you might end up fearing that you're going to get left behind. As a Tottenham fan, this is yet more evidence that I worry about Daniel Levy being the poster boy of all things financial fair play. And so for him to join forces and start to participate in those sorts of mechanics will essentially look like he is a hypocrite. But if I'm entirely honest, he absolutely needs to do it. And if you are a fan of Tottenham or a fan of a football club that behaves and participates and does things by the traditional mechanisms and opportunities that exist, then I think it's time to start asking for your board, your owner, to start getting clever, because the direction of travel looks to me to be incredibly worrying. And I wouldn't have put West Ham until very recently in the bucket of teams that I would worry about being the next team to dissent and to move into the group of teams that reject tightening of rules to keep that balance and level playing field. It looks to me like it's a fait accompli that eventually FFP and PSR will die. Some say it's already dead on arrival. But to me, this news around the overlapping ownership between Palace, Crystal Palace, West Ham, and Chelsea, alongside Chelsea's relationships with Newcastle, Newcastle relationships with Aston Villa, all of their relationships with Saudi Arabia, you can just see how there is a bit of a tangled web of overlap that really is going to have incredibly more experiences of back scratching. And if you're not part of that cabal, then you might get left behind. Let me know your thoughts, guys. Like, subscribe, and comment. And as always,